Thank you so much for having me. My name is Francie Roesner. I go by Francie. I'm an associate professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab there, so we focus broadly on different computer security and privacy topics. And I'm really excited to be here today. I think we rescheduled this like 3 different times for various illnesses and so on, and so I'm so thrilled that it's actually happening today. By the way, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to spend more time on anything, repeat anything, whatever is most interesting to you all. But I thought I'd start by giving just a little bit of overview of who I am and how I got here. So I was born in Germany, actually. My parents are German, and we moved to Austin, Texas when I was 3 years old because my dad actually still works at IBM, and they moved him over there. And then I grew up in Austin. I went to UT Austin for undergrad, where I did computer science. I actually did computer science completely by accident. I was planning to do something else, and then I took a few classes on the encouragement of some academic advisors, and then I really liked the process of writing code and building technology. And then going into my PhD, I realized that computer security was a field. And computer security is all about thinking about how things will go wrong and what assumptions we make when we're designing the things that people are using that might be violated, especially by intentional adversaries. Thank you. I did my PhD actually at the University of Washington. I moved to Seattle in 2009. I did some internships at various technology companies. My first time in Seattle was actually interning at Amazon, where I happened to meet my husband, and we now live 2 blocks away from here. So if you ever see me and or my kids out, we walk around these various streets, so please say hi. These are Sophie and Ellie. They are 2 and 5. So that's me in a nutshell. So like I said, I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab. And really what motivates our work is thinking about all of these things that might go wrong. So the last few decades have been a really crazy time in terms of technology development. And many things that were not computerized are now computerized. It's not just the obvious computers that we're using, like the laptops and the smartphones, but also things like cameras and cars and medical devices and public transit and planes, and really everything has computers embedded in it. And that's exciting. That brings lots of potential new benefits. For example, modern automobiles contain many computers, and that improves the safety and the efficiency of those vehicles tremendously. So these are all, for the most part, they're great things. They've changed the way we interact with the physical world, with each other, online, and so on. But of course, what I'll be talking about and what really motivates the work of my lab is thinking about how these things can go wrong. And for all the benefits that they also bring serious security and privacy risks. So that's really the goal of our research lab. We consist of 3 faculty co-directors and about maybe up to 20 or so PhD students, and then undergraduate researchers, postdoctoral researchers, really focusing on this broad question of what can go wrong with technology and how can we address those issues. So what will be the new security, privacy, and safety issues that arise with emerging technologies? What are users facing today? And how should we be redesigning these systems or otherwise thinking about it? And this is what really drew me to this field, this idea of thinking like an adversary, not just thinking, how can we make this better? What can we use this for? But stopping to think, what are the assumptions we're making that might be violated by someone who's trying to violate our privacy or our security? And so because of this is really a mindset rather than kind of a specific area of computer science. So it's really something that we can apply to anything. We can think about low-level technologies, we can think about the hardware that's in our computers, all the way to thinking about humans and the people who are interacting with these computers and the decisions they make and the security needs that they have. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that each of you can potentially do to help keep yourself safe online. So this is a photo of some subset of our lab attending what was our first back to in-person conference this last fall. And so just to kind of give you a sense of many of the things I'll be talking about were done in collaboration with many of these are mostly PhD students or former PhD students that you see here. So there are many, many different things that I could talk about that we cover in our lab and in the broader technology space. Really, we could pick anything, and I could probably talk to you about it for an hour. But the area that I wanted to talk about today is one that I think is probably close to the technology that you experience in your daily lives or the people close to you, which is talking about privacy and safety on the web. So a lot of the work that our lab has been doing over the last decade or so has been studying the online advertising ecosystem and the privacy concerns that come along with that. And I'll get into much more detail about what that means and what the potential concerns are. But really the context that we're thinking about here is the web. So using a web browser like Firefox or Google Chrome or Edge, which used to be Internet Explorer, any one of these things, or the equivalent on a smartphone device or a tablet. When you're browsing the web, you might go to Google, you might search for something, you might visit some websites, you might shop on Amazon. As you're doing all of this browsing, what is actually going on under the hood that might be concerning from a privacy perspective? So in particular, the area that we've been studying is around this online advertising ecosystem. So this may be an experience that you've had before where you are visiting some website, maybe you're shopping for something, you go to Zappos.com and you check out some shoes, and then next thing you know, you go to other websites, like maybe you go to CNN, or maybe you go to The Onion or some entertainment site, and you notice that all of a sudden these exact shoes that you were looking at have started following you around the web. And every time I mention this, people chuckle a little bit because this is such a familiar experience in our modern online ecosystem. In some ways we've started to take it for granted. But it's also a little bit creepy, and it makes you wonder, how is it that this website, how does CNN, why is this showing up on CNN? How do they know, and who knows that I've looked at these shoes? And so this is a topic that computer security and privacy researchers and policymakers have been thinking about for over a decade now as this ecosystem has evolved. I'll talk a bit today about two layers here. One is the underlying layer of the technical mechanisms, like how is this happening, who's doing it, and how is it happening in your browser. But then I'll also talk about the actual content of the ads that you see, which in some cases can be very useful to you. Like if you really wanted these shoes and it starts showing you different versions of the same shoes, maybe that's more useful to you than some random ad. But some of the content in these ads can also be problematic, so I'll talk a little bit about that today. So the fundamental thing that is happening here is that you're visible to you, you're visiting CNN, you're visiting The Onion, you're visiting Zappos. But underneath all of that, as part of those web pages, there's actually another company that you've probably never heard of. In this case, in this example, this is a company called Criteo. And that company exists to collect information about your browsing behaviors and then serve you, oops. I wish I could say that this was an intentional demonstration of a computer security attack.
You've been attacked.
Exactly. Let's see if I redo this. Okay, there we go. So essentially this company, and I'll show you how it does this, is tracking you around the web and saying, this user, they might not know literally you and your name, but this same person, this same browser, has visited all of these different sites, and I can link them together. And one of the things that bothers us as privacy advocates from a privacy perspective is that not only is this hidden from most users, maybe before I've explained this to you, you didn't even realize exactly what was happening here, but it happens even, you don't have to do anything for it to happen. It's not just if you click on those ads that Criteo learns something, it's just from visiting CNN, and CNN has included these ads that Criteo is learning this information. So what is the information that Criteo is learning? Yes, please.
Well, could I ask, is Criteo hired
buy these other companies to do this, or are they doing it on their own?
That's a good question. The question is Criteo hired by these other companies to do this, or are they doing it on their own? The short answer is that they are essentially hired by these other companies. So CNN, part of why this happens is that the web is financially supported by ads. So CNN needs to make money. They don't charge for subscriptions, or maybe not, they don't get enough money from subscriptions. So they put these advertisements, they basically sell space on their page, the same way that they might have, the physical New York Times or Seattle Times sells advertising space in its pages. The big difference is that the physical Seattle Times, those are fixed ads. They have an agreement with some company. Everybody who picks up the Seattle Times sees the same ad that's there. Maybe they've done some analysis of who their audience is and what would be a good ad. On the web, this is all very personalized. So there's a lot of different things happening, and it might involve companies that even CNN is not aware of. So CNN might sell this ad space to one ad network, and that ad network then goes out and talks to a bunch of different other companies and says, I've got this ad slot here on CNN for this user who's really interested in these shoes. How much do you want to pay for this ad slot? And this happens in real time. Like as you are loading the page, this ad auction is happening where some company will then bid highest and get that spot to serve that ad to you. And of course, to bid high, they want to know more information about you. So a lot of what is going on in this industry is that they are trying to collect information as much as possible and make inferences about what kinds of ads you would like to see and you would like to click on. And so from a privacy perspective, why do we care about this? The answer might be, maybe this is actually fine. Maybe we are making a trade for free content. We're not paying for CNN. We are paying for CNN metaphorically with our privacy. And for many users, this is probably not an immediate issue. You might think about people for whom there is sensitive behavior that they might want to hide. So what is it that Criteo learns? Well, at the basic level, Criteo learns which websites you visited. All the websites that, like CNN, have a contract with Criteo, when you visit those, Criteo learns you've been there. So over time, they might say, okay, the user with this identifier, user123, I don't know who that is, but user123 has been to CNN, they've been to The Onion, they've been to a bunch of different sites. And so that might include, for some people, especially high-profile people, you could imagine, think about a politician, for example, this might include sites that reveal sensitive information about them, about their political views or their sexual orientation or their health information, things like that. So that's one of the reasons that we care about this from a privacy perspective, is just literally the leaking of which sites you've been visiting. But over time, of course, like I said, this industry is trying to learn about you and make inferences. It's not just the sites that they collect, but what do they do with this information? And so really the holy grail for them is to try to learn as much as possible about an individual so that they can be as effective as possible in targeting an ad to you that you're likely to click on. And so that means they don't just know the websites you visit, they might also learn identifiers like your email address or your physical address. Because, for example, as you asked, CNN is working with this site, so they might actually leak information directly to them and say, hey, I have this logged in user, john@gmail.com, and please serve an ad for John. And so there are all these different companies and data brokers that are exchanging all this information. You see it even in the physical world. If you ever get physical mailers that are addressed to you, relevant to your interests, it's all part of the same ecosystem of companies that are trying to understand our online and offline behaviors for marketing and so on. So, like I said, this is all really done for targeting ads at you. And on the one hand, like I said, this is quite useful. Useful ads are probably preferable to not useful ads if we're going to have ads at all. But it also has this sense of just being a little bit creepy. Like you didn't really see that this was happening. You didn't really agree that this should happen. Maybe you clicked through some dialogue that said blah, 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 something about cookies. Everybody just clicks through those because you don't really have a choice. You can't, you're either going to use the website or not. And if you're going to use the website, you're going to click OK. And you can't really reason about or change what it is that they're collecting. And And over time, the privacy concerns here have grown because the companies have gotten better and better using more data, more advanced machine learning techniques. They've gotten better and better at making inferences about you. So starting off, this is a screenshot of a Wall Street Journal expose from 2010. This was kind of around the time that people started getting really concerned about this and this industry started taking off. So there was a very nice expose early on from the Wall Street Journal where they pointed out that it's not just that these trackers get anonymous, unique identifiers about you, but that they can use all this information to make sensitive inferences about you, like your interests, your gender, your age, your sexual orientation, your political views, your health information, you name it. And over time, it's been increasingly the case that we worry not just that somebody knows this information, but how might they use it. So for example, there are, to some extent, some of the things that I'm about to show you are not actively happening, but they're kind of on the cusp of happening. People are worried that they're happening. So for example, these companies might be able to make inferences about your health state. They might know if someone has depression or if someone has a substance abuse issue, and they might then exploit that information for ad targeting purposes, or they might sell that information for insurance company purposes and so on. And again, it's not clear that exactly all of these data flows are happening today, but I want to illustrate kind of the potential that privacy people are concerned about, and to some extent some of this is happening now. People also worry about differential pricing. So if a website knows that you really need to buy that flight, or you are in maybe at midnight on Fridays, you tend to make big purchases, maybe you've had a few drinks, then they can target you with differential pricing that they could not do in the physical world. Marketers, of course, play plenty of tricks in the physical world as well, like things are priced $9.99 instead of $10 because the human brain somehow thinks that $9.99 is less, it just feels less. And that's maybe a little bit manipulative, but at least it's uniformly manipulative for everyone. One of the concerns here is that these companies can collect all of this data and target and exploit individuals at vulnerable moments or who are more vulnerable than others. And the most recent area in which we've had concern about this is related to misinformation or fake news or other kind of manipulative content online. So you may have heard about concerns around the 2016 election, that there were companies that used Facebook data to target particular types of information at people and try to sway their opinions and so on. And it's unclear how successful this type of thing was, but especially in the academic research context, we're often thinking about not just what's happening today, but what is this going to look like in the next election and the next election when companies have more and more data and the ability to target individuals with information. The version of the article that I see and the version of the article that you see might be different depending on what kind of spin we might be vulnerable to. Okay, so let me tell you just a little bit on a technical level how this is actually happening, because it's not magic and it's actually kind of a simple part of just how the web works. So you may have heard of the term cookies before. You may have agreed to cookie dialogues on different websites. And cookies are really just tiny little bits of text that are stored inside your web browser. So inside, say if you use Firefox, inside your Firefox, there's just essentially a bunch of little files of text that are associated with different websites. And the whole point of those is to allow those websites to re-identify you. And most of the time, or much of the time, that's actually useful. Like if you go to Amazon.com and you log in, Amazon has now verified that you've entered the correct password. You don't want to have to log in on every single Amazon page. You actually want Amazon to remember you, at least for a while. And the way that that works is with a cookie. Amazon will basically say, okay, this person has logged in correctly. Let me create this special little text file that includes some value that I will give you to hold on to. It's kind of like getting a ticket to an event or something like that that you have to keep showing at every door you go to. And so then every time your browser talks to Amazon, your browser will say, oh, Amazon, right, I've got a ticket. I've got this cookie for Amazon. I'm going to show it. And Amazon is going to check it and say, oh, right, this is a valid cookie. It corresponds to this user. So come on in. You don't have to enter your password again. And so this is pretty fundamental to how the web works. And it's happening all the time. Basically every site that you talk to, like when you go to The Onion or CNN or Amazon, they each have their own separate little cookie that they store. And what happens when you load that web page, it's actually your computer, your browser, talks over the internet. That's what these little lines here are signifying. They basically talk over the internet to other computers that are sitting somewhere in like Amazon's data center or wherever, and those are the servers. And it's at the servers that all of this checking is happening. So The Onion says, this cookie corresponds to this user. I will now produce the personalized page for john@gmail.com and send it back to the browser, and then your browser is just going to show you what The Onion sent back to you. Yes?
I've got a couple of browsers
Yeah.
that allow me to be private.
Yeah.
And also I get an option, accept cookies or not.
Yeah.
So how does this work?
Yeah, so for the accept cookies or not, that's something that's actually changed a little bit recently. So let me actually come back to that question in just a moment. I'm going to complicate this picture a little bit, and then your question relates to that. For the browsers that you have that are providing some privacy properties, do you know what they're called? Yeah, so DuckDuckGo is a website that tries to minimize traffic on it. There's a few other things I'll talk about a few later. There's a few tools you can use. If this is starting to concern you and you're like, ugh, what should I do about this? I have a few recommendations later that can help. Yeah. Okay, so I've not introduced anything about ads yet. This is just when you're visiting regular websites, even if they had no ads, this is happening. And this is nice because the websites know who we are, and they're websites we visited on purpose. So it's not undesirable that they would know who we are. Now the problem starts to come because websites can be complicated, and as we've talked about, websites like CNN can essentially sell some of their space to advertisers. So this is what's called, in browser terminology, a first party and a third party. So a first party is that website that you went to on purpose. So here, The Onion and CNN are first parties. They're the ones, if you look at the top of your browser and it says Amazon.com, that's the first party. And the third party are all of those things that load as part of that page that are not obvious to you. So how does that work? It's basically the website itself delegates that space. It sells the space or otherwise includes it. And this can be used for lots of purposes, not just ads. But for example, if I make a website, so I have a website at franziroesner.com, and I can put inside that website stuff that I get from other websites. And there's a few ways to do it, but one of them is to use this thing called an iframe, where when I'm creating my website, I put an iframe and I say, in this rectangle on my page, I'd like the browser to please actually load this other website. So in this example, which is actually on my website, it's probably hard to see, but what you have there is I've just created a blank website, and I wrote, this text is outside the iframe, and then I put an iframe, and inside that iframe, I loaded washington.edu. So what you see inside there is actually the actual washington.edu website. But if you look at the browser URL bar, the first party is my website, franziroesner.com. I've just taken this rectangle and handed it off to washington.edu. But you as a user actually can't see that anywhere. It doesn't say washington.edu anywhere. And this was designed initially to allow websites to compose components from different things. So, you might want to include an image from somewhere else or combine multiple websites together. But it's actually largely used for ads. Oh, right, so this animation shows you a little bit better. The first party is what you've got in the URL bar, and then the third party is anything that's loaded in there. I've done it with washington.edu for illustration, but on CNN, that's going to be an ad. And so now if we put these things together, what happens is that it's not just the first parties that have cookies, it's also the third parties that have cookies, and the browser will send those as well. So after your browser talks to the Onion server, and the Onion says, okay, here's the website, here's what the website looks like, your browser draws that website on your screen. As part of drawing that, it's processing things like, oh, there's an iframe for an ad. In order to fill this iframe, I now need to make another request to Criteo. So your browser is going to talk over the internet again, but this time to Criteo as the endpoint, and include Criteo's cookie. And Criteo has, just like all the other sites, set some anonymous identifier in this little text file. And the important thing is that Criteo's cookie is always going to be the same. So if the Onion includes Criteo and it dispatches a request from your browser, that's going to be the same cookie as when later CNN includes Criteo. And it's really that simple. Criteo is getting these requests and processing them and can then keep track of things. So every time it gets one of these requests for user 789, it's going to be able to say, this request came from CNN, this request came from Fox News, this request came from, Amazon.com or whatever. So that's the basic idea. That's what's going on. That's what's behind those ads you see that follow you around. It's just websites including other websites and storing information about you and then aggregating all of it together. So, what can we do about this? One thing that's going on here, and this is, I'll get to your question now about enabling or disabling cookies, is that one problem is that these cookies are saying who you are. If Criteo didn't have these cookies, they'd have a lot harder time saying this is actually the same user. So there are ways to disable third-party cookies. There are multiple ways to do it. One way to do it is to disable them directly in your browser settings. There's a way to do that. And it varies by browser how exactly you do that. It's also now, this is these dialogues that you might see on a page when you come to a website, and what's new over the last few years is you might see this dialogue as part of the web page that says, we use cookies to optimize your experience, something, something, clearly some lawyers wrote it, and you can choose to either reject the cookies or enable them. The honest answer is that that's a little bit tricky. If you're concerned about this, I would definitely recommend disabling the cookies or keeping only the necessary cookies or whatever options it gives you, and that will reduce your tracking footprint. The unfortunate follow-on to that is that it's not perfect because there's some we've actually been studying this with some collaborators in Europe around the European privacy legislation. There's some ambiguity in what they can include as necessary cookies and so on, so that of course they're still trying to get as much as possible. But I would say that this has been a place we've seen a lot of movement in the last few years. Not only has the privacy legislation caused websites to have to be more upfront about the cookies and at least give you some options, the browsers themselves are actually changing how they are designed. So rather than having, for example, Criteo have the same cookie no matter if Criteo appeared on CNN or The Onion, to us as users, these seem like different contexts, like Criteo on The Onion and Criteo on CNN. Why do they get the same version of my identity? Why aren't those just separated? And that's a good question, and that's actually what browsers are now working towards, to have kind of to separate out Criteo's view of you on these different sites. It's a long process to make these changes in these browsers because the web is large and complicated and involves a lot of money, and making changes that are not compatible with current websites is hard. But all of the major browsers are now moving towards more privacy-preserving designs. So, okay, have we solved the problem? You can probably guess what I'm going to say, which is unfortunately not. And one of the big reasons is that cookies are not necessary for tracking. They make it really easy, but there are still other ways to essentially fingerprint you and identify you. So this is one thing that browsers are now grappling with and that researchers are studying, which is, and in fact, what trackers are doing, which is even if I don't have a cookie about you, or you've deleted your cookies, or even you've maybe moved between your phone and your laptop, I'd love, as an advertiser, still to be able to re-identify you and say, hey, this person who, passed by Starbucks is the same person who I'm going to show this Starbucks ad in their home. You can imagine that advertisers might really like to be able to do that. But even on a single device, without a cookie, it's a little bit harder. You don't have this easy, unique identifier to re-identify somebody. And so there's been what we think of in computer security as an arms race of defenders and attackers, where the trackers are collecting more and more information to try to fingerprint you. And this is maybe actually a little bit surprising, because most of us there's only a few different browsers, a few different operating systems that we might use. So how unique could an individual user who doesn't have an identifier associated with them really look? And it turns out that they can look quite unique. So you can run some code in the website to fingerprint the browser. You can look at things like, what fonts does this user have installed? There's really tricky ways to do this. You can do timing measurements, like different hardware. Even if I had 2 versions of this exact laptop, the physical hardware in the computer is of course different. They're 2 different physical devices, and at the physical level, they are just slightly different, such that if you timed how long it took you to do something in a very fine-grained way, you could see some differences, but those differences are consistent on the same device. So there's a lot of increasingly tricky ways of trying to fingerprint people's machines and say, you know what, I don't even care if you have a cookie or not, because with high enough confidence, using this fingerprint of what browser, what operating system, what screen resolution, what fonts, these details about hardware timing, all of that together, I can still create a reliable enough fingerprint. So if you're curious about this sort of thing, there's actually a nice website from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which, if you don't know it, is a nonprofit digital rights organization that does a bunch of great work on this and many other topics. And they have a website that is called Cover Your Tracks now, I think. It used to be called something different. Where you can essentially go with your browser and kind of check out how identifiable you are. So this was what I saw when I went to this page. It says, our tests indicate that you have strong protection against web tracking. And I'll give you a couple of recommendations, I think, on the next slide. But for example, I'm blocking ads, I'm blocking trackers. It tested that, and that's helping reduce the attack surface for me. But you can see this last part here, which it says, am I protected from fingerprinting? And the answer is no, your browser has a unique fingerprint. So even with some of the best tools available, this is still there. So there's actually a lot happening now in terms of the browser vendors also thinking about, to what extent do legitimate websites need this granularity of information, or how much can we reduce it so that this tracking becomes less reliable? Okay. One thing I wanted to talk about for a couple of slides is just to pop all the way up. So we've been talking about the technical mechanisms of how the browser is loading pages and so on, but what about the ads themselves? What is the content in the ads that you see? And that's something that we've been studying in our lab as well. We've been looking, for example, at what are the ads that are shown during the election season. When you visit different news websites, a lot of what you see on those pages is news, but a lot of what you see is actually sponsored content or advertisements. And it's sometimes hard to distinguish, even for experts in this field, which things are ads and which things are actual news articles. So that's one thing that I wanted to warn you about, is to keep an eye out for these things. So in particular, there's a type of ad called a native ad that is designed deceptively, intentionally, to look just like a news article. So what you see here is a screenshot of some website, I can't remember which, but what you see is at the top, those things are actual articles on the page, and these things on the bottom here that I've just outlined in red, those are actually ads, but they look exactly the same. Like, if you look really closely, you see that it says Taboola feed. If you happen to know that Taboola is an ad company, you would know that, but who knows what Taboola is if you're not studying this. These also say sponsored in small text, so you might notice that, but again, what does sponsored mean? And they really walk the line of making this as not noticeable as possible. So this is, as you're browsing the web, this is just something to be aware of, that it's not just that there are privacy implications, but also much of the information you see might themselves be ads. So if you see something that looks a little bit like maybe too good or bad to be true, you might look closer and make sure that you are not accidentally interpreting an ad as a news article. One of the things we've also been studying in this context is not just the design of the ads, but also the content of them. And some ad content is great. It's like, these are exactly the shoes I was looking for. This is a great idea for a Christmas gift for my kids, something like that. Then there are some ads that are clearly bad. There are ads that are actual scams. Those are rare and they get taken down pretty quickly. But there are a lot of ads kind of in the middle that are not exactly scams. They're not exactly lies. They don't get taken down. But I also just want to alert you to this style of ad to kind of check your own cognitive biases as you see them. So there are a lot of these type of clickbait and other ads that are intentionally manipulatively designed to entice you to click. So these are things like Washington seniors on Medicare are getting a big payday. This is an ad, leads to an article that doesn't actually have any real information, might try to convince you to spend money on something that's not actually what it promises, but they are written in such a way that they sound enticing. They often omit some information, like they say, top gut doctor warns, throw out this vegetable immediately. And you're like, oh, what vegetable? I must know what vegetable I should throw out. And of course it takes you down some path of low quality information. So again, I would caution you when you see these ads. We've been studying them. They are all over the web. And often the underlying articles are either poorly disclosed advertisements or a little bit scammy or actual scams. Or they're just low quality information. So I have a few more, I won't talk through all of them, I have a few more examples on the next slide. For example, around the election, these are the types of ads we saw a lot, which are these things that look like polls. So this one says Trump impeachment poll. Trump impeachment poll, do you support Trump? Click yes or no. And this will appear on some sort of news website. And it entices you to maybe want to give your voice to this poll. But it's not actually a real poll. It's not actually collecting useful information. What it's doing is it's trying to entice you to click on the ad. Then it's going to ask you for your email address to register your vote or something like that. And then they're going to take your email address and put it on some mailing list, and they're going to start sending you a bunch more deceptive stuff. So again, if something looks like too interesting to click on, I would be a little bit cautious. And then we see these types of advertorials, investment pitches, supplement scams, and so on. And then we also see this category of it's not really trying to get you to do anything other than click, but it's low quality information on the borderline of misinformation. So this is one of my favorite examples. It says, viral video exposes something fishy in Biden's speeches. And the underlying content of the article is really, it might as well have been written by like a chatbot or something. The underlying article really has no substance, but this conveys this sense of like, this politician is not trustworthy. And we saw this kind of content around the election about all sorts of politicians, both sides of the aisle and so on. And these really concern me because they're all about just making money on ads. They're not trying to spread real information. Maybe they're, the motivations here are not even really to change your mind about Biden or not, but to get you to click and to make more money for the website and more money for the advertisers. They're just exploiting people's sense of curiosity. But I worry that the side effect is that many people don't even recognize that this wasn't a news article, but rather this crappy sponsored content. And so to the extent that this might stick in people's minds, like, oh, I saw somewhere that Biden's speeches are not really trustworthy, without even attributing it to the underlying motivations of the advertiser, concern me. Okay, so let me move on to what you can do about this. One thing you might hear about is specific web browsers. This is something you would use to replace Chrome or Firefox that have certain privacy properties. So in particular, Brave is the logo at the top, is a web browser that's being designed by including folks who have previously worked at these other companies to try to patch some of these issues. I don't personally use Brave because I like the convenience of using a well-supported web browser that fits into like the Google ecosystem where I also have my email and so on. So I mention it just so you know it's out there and you can look into it, but I don't necessarily think that you need to go to the extreme of changing your entire web browser. But what you can do without changing your web browser is there are a number of browser extensions or add-ons that exist that slightly change the functionality of your browser. You might be using some of these already, like ad blockers, which do a lot towards privacy, tracker blocking as well. But these are things like AdBlock Plus, which will block ads and third-party tracking requests. Ghostery is another one that's pretty popular. That one's nice because it also shows you a bit of a visualization of what are all the different trackers on the page. So if you're just curious now, like let me browse the web and see what's out there, Ghostery is a nice one that shows you a little bit of that. The one that I use is called Privacy Badger. The reason I use it is that it was created by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is this nonprofit that I mentioned, and so I trust their incentives. I think, for instance, Ghostery and AdBlock Plus have some, they're trying to figure out how to exist in a world where the advertising industry is powerful, and so I think they have some partnerships there. I'm sure that they are trying to do their best, but I think the EFF has the clearest motivations in support of users. So that's the one I like. It also actually includes some code that we wrote at the University of Washington a number of years ago to block a certain type of tracker. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about was, I've been talking all about the web and privacy, but there are a few other tips that may or may not be useful to you. These are maybe things that you already do, but I was thinking about what actionable things can I leave you all with that would actually improve your security and privacy online from my perspective. So probably the biggest thing is, even bigger than web tracking, is to keep your accounts secure, and that means things like email accounts, bank accounts, social media accounts, things like that. There's a few best practices that we talk about in the computer security community. One big one is to use different passwords for different websites. The advantage of that is that it just reduces your risk for any given situation. So for example, it is not uncommon for websites to have password database breaches, and if those websites are storing those passwords in a secure way, that's not quite as bad as it sounds. It's usually not literally your passwords, but some essentially encrypted version of your password. But even so, there are database breaches all the time, or your password might be guessed or stolen by somebody. And if you use different passwords for different websites, it just reduces your risk. So if, Facebook, for example, has a password database breach, but you use a different password on Gmail, you don't need to worry that the adversaries are going to go through that list and start just trying your account name and your password on all the other sites. So that's the idea with that. One big downside is that it's very hard to remember a bunch of different passwords. And so there are tools you can use for that, different password managers that maybe some of you already use. But one thing I would say that maybe is a little bit surprising is that it can actually be okay to write your passwords down. And I feel like I need to hide from the paranoid computer security community saying that. But it's all about what type of attack it is that you're worried about. Like if you're worried that somebody is, if you write your password on a sticky note and stick it to your monitor or something like that, if you're worried that someone is going to come into that room and steal your password, and you don't trust the people with physical access to your room, obviously don't write the password down. But as a general principle, especially if you might be the computer security community pretends this is not the case, but is increasingly realizing it. People share passwords. They share passwords in intimate relationships. They share passwords with family and so on. And that can actually be okay. If your concern is more like some remote adversary is trying to guess my password and get into my Bank of America account, I'm not worried about the people physically close to me because they maybe already know my passwords. They maybe even share access to that account. I'm worried about, someone sitting in pick your least favorite foreign country and getting access to my bank account. then by all means write the password down. You're not going to physically see it in your space, and you might benefit by being able to have a stronger and more unique password if you write it down. I think there's a question over here, yeah.
Just a question about password managers.
Yeah.
Recently, LastPass been hacked.
Yeah.
Would you comment in terms of how much risk there is associated with that? It seems like those are encrypted account information that they're looking at.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly all the details of LastPass, but I think this is kind of a general risk for anything that you use. One thing we talk about even in like our introductory computer security classes, there's no such thing as perfect security. You're never going to have a system that is impossible to break with the strong adversary. It's always about raising the bar for the attackers. And so things like being able to know when there's a breach, being able to rotate passwords, making it more difficult because those passwords were not stored in plain text but rather encrypted, all of that makes it better. I think one downside of a password manager is this idea that you are centralizing your trust. You now have some company like LastPass that has all of your passwords, and you hope that they're storing them well and that they have good security. I still think, on the whole, if you use one of these reputable password managers, it's worth it, because the risk of, especially for some of your more sensitive accounts like your email or your bank account, having a strong password goes a long way towards protecting that account, and the risk from LastPass is less than the risk of having an insecure password on those. But it is a trade-off. You've now centralized, you are relying on LastPass or whoever to have good practices. Yeah, that's a good question. One other thing, again, this is actually big topics in computer security, the different pros and cons of these different options in terms of how secure they are versus how easy they are to use. For sensitive accounts, you might be forced to do so, but even if not, you might consider using two-factor authentication, which means in addition to a password, you might have something else, like it might send you a text message with a code, or you might have an app with a code on a smartphone. In fact, to log into my account here on this computer, I had to use my second factor, and it can be annoying, like when you don't have your phone, but it really protects against a lot of remote attacks. Or attacks really for anyone who doesn't have your phone, because it means that you could have the least secure password in the world. You know, my password could be like literally password on my University of Washington account, but you know, I could even tell you my password right now. That wouldn't help you because I would have to authorize on this device the login, and so that really changes the equation. One other thing that is good to keep in mind, and I think this is something that in our rational mind space, when we're not in stress, we all know this, but in a stressful situation we can forget, which is that if someone is reaching out to you to ask for sensitive information, that's a situation where you should be cautious. And adversaries, they try to put you in a stressful situation, so you think you need to respond right away and you don't have a chance to think about this. So you might get a call from someone who is like, this is the Bank of America and your account has been compromised and your funds are draining out and we need to know your social security number and your password right now to stop this. And so they put you in a stressful situation, but that's exactly you should always, if you get, actually I got one just a few days ago, I got a text from supposedly the Bank of America saying I had a compromised account and I should call this number, and I recognized it as a spam or a scam message. But if I was legitimately concerned, like maybe there was a breach to my Bank of America account, the right thing for me to do would have been to call the Bank of America, go to the Bank of America website and call them from a number that I found, not the number that they gave me on the text message. So that's just kind of an attack pattern to watch out for. And more generally, I mentioned this before, but a good rule of thumb, it's very hard to identify potential misinformation and scams online. It's hard for everyone. Even I know plenty of computer security researchers who have their own stories of how they fell for something. But the general rule of thumb is if something seems too good or too bad to be true, be a little bit skeptical, because they're kind of preying on our cognitive biases as humans. And finally, to do something that's called lateral reading. This is a term that's popular in the misinformation research community. Essentially, find other sources to verify what it is that you're looking at. So if you see some article that says, if you do this thing, if you eat this, take this supplement, then it will save you from this illness or something like that. Go to a Google search or a DuckDuckGo search or something and search for other sources that corroborate that. Okay, and with that, I will stop. I'm happy to stick around a bit and answer any more questions that you have, but I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak with you all. Yeah.
Why not just create a fake personality, a shadow me, and how would one go about doing that?
It's a really good question. So why not create a shadow me to exist on the web? I think there are some solutions that try to use this idea. Like another related idea is, why not just inject a bunch of noise into what I'm doing? Like in addition to my actual web browsing, maybe I should be like loading a bunch of pages that I'm not interested in and just completely confuse the profile. And that can work to some extent. I think there are two challenges. One is that these companies are so motivated to develop technology to be able to make useful inferences that a lot of the things we try to do to obfuscate can actually be undone with all of the data that they have. And the other thing is that it's just actually hard to separate these things because all the companies are also sharing and selling data on the back end. So somewhere you have a real identity with a real credit card, making real purchases of a phone or something like that. And I don't mean necessarily that these things get directly linked, but because you have a real physical identity, if it gets linked to your fake identity somehow, like maybe you even just use the same browser to log into your real account and your shadow account, they will get linked. So I think it's very hard to fully keep those separate, but I think it is a nice idea and certainly makes for a good experiment. Yeah.
Will cookies clog up your computer?
Good question. Will cookies clog up your computer? Cookies should not. Cookies are really just tiny bits of text, and compared to like the memory that your browser requires to load a web page, are really, really tiny. So the cookies by themselves won't. There are other things that can happen, like if websites encourage you to download browser extensions or other files or something like that, that can happen. And frankly, the modern web is just very bloated, and if you use, for example, Google Chrome, actually, interestingly, because of some of the security advancements they've made and how web pages are loaded, it takes a lot of your computer's memory to load pages, so sometimes it may feel like things are slow just because of that, but the cookies alone won't do it. Yeah.
So when you order something online, are these trackers able to then get your physical address because you've had something shipped to you?
It depends on how the system is set up. In many cases, they might, because there's this partnership between the website you're ordering from and the advertisers. So there have been studies looking at, for example, when some website loads trackers, if CNN, for example, is loading these ads, CNN's engineers are actually the ones writing the code to load those advertisers, and the advertisers might say, to use our ad platform, what you need to do is you need to, if you have it, provide the user's email address as part of the request or something like that. So it might be that the website on which the trackers appear is directly sharing information about you. I think probably physical address is not being shared as often as email address for various reasons, including I think that it's more privacy sensitive. But it's technically possible, yeah. Yeah.
How useful is it to delete your history?
How useful is it to delete your history? Yeah. It is useful for certain things, but not for trackers. Actually, a related question that some of you may have is, what about private browsing mode or incognito mode, which some of these browsers have? What do they do? That will actually help you more against someone who has physical access to your computer who might say like, I wonder what websites you visited, but it won't delete it from any tracker who's been observing your behavior. It won't delete it from them. And tracker, actually, it used to be the case that there were tricks websites could use to directly read your history out of your browser, but that was not intentional, and browsers have fixed that. So whether or not you have your history in your browser is actually not accessible to the websites. Similarly with private browsing or incognito mode, it's really a way of not storing your history. So you might go into incognito mode, do some searches that you feel are sensitive that you don't want stored on your computer, go back out. It's not stored on your computer, but the websites that you visited in incognito mode might have still seen you and identified you. Now, browsers have realized also that people think that private browsing mode sounds like it's providing privacy. It was providing privacy against not the thing we were all thinking. Maybe it's privacy against other people in your house, which is maybe not that helpful in some cases. So they have private browsing mode, especially I think on Firefox, does a few other things. It blocks third-party cookies. I think it maybe blocks a few other things to try to also protect you a bit against tracking. Yeah, I'll let it back.
Are there some browsers that you feel are safer than others?
Yeah, are there some browsers that are safer than others? I think Brave is the one that is designed specifically with these types of things in mind, but all the browsers have been moving more and more towards privacy-respecting designs. Just in terms of company incentives, there's a difference, for example, between Chrome, which is created by Google, who of course has a major advertising business. So while Chrome has also been moving towards getting rid of third-party cookies and so on, they still need to think about, well, if we get rid of third-party cookies, we don't want to kill the whole internet advertising industry, or we are going to not exist anymore. And so my impression is that the people working on Chrome do have user privacy as a value. But for example, Firefox does not have that business constraint. Firefox is a company that cares about privacy and really it doesn't need to worry about online advertising existing in the same way. So some people would say, ideologically, Firefox may be more aligned with users. Personally, I use Chrome because I like it, and maybe I've given up on protecting my own browsing history.